Life in Burlington, Vermont was supposed to be simple. That was the deal when Abigail and I said, I do. A house surrounded by hills, a small contracting business to keep me busy, and our little girl, Clara, to light up every corner of our lives. It was all so neat. Too neat, maybe. If I had known my wife was hiding a nuclear bomb behind those innocent blue eyes, I might have thought twice before signing on for this suburban fairy tale. It all started with one of those stupid DNA test kits. You know the ones. They promise to tell you which 2% of your blood comes from Iceland and whether or not you're related to Cleopatra. I got mine for free from a supplier, and the guys at work were buzzing about theirs. I thought, what the hell? Maybe I'll find out I've got Viking roots. What I didn't expect was to find out my kid wasn't mine. When the email came, I opened it with the same excitement you'd have unwrapping a gift on Christmas morning. The only problem was this gift punched me right in the face. Clara's DNA? Not a match. I reread it 3 times, each time convincing myself there had to be a mistake. Lab mix-up, maybe? But deep down, something cold started to spread in my chest. I should have stopped there and gone on pretending, but nope, I had to dig. I tried bringing it up casually with Abigail over dinner. Hey babe, ever think about doing one of those ancestry kits? I said, my voice dripping with fake innocence. She looked up from her plate like a deer in headlights. No, not really. Why? Her voice was tight, her hands fidgeting with her fork. She looked guilty as hell, but I didn't push that night. I wanted to catch her in her lie when she couldn't wriggle out of it. A week later, the dam broke. I couldn't hold it in anymore. One night after Clara went to bed, I sat Abigail down at the kitchen table and asked the question that had been burning a hole in my chest. Is there something you need to tell me? Her face went pale as milk. She set her coffee mug down so fast it spilled over the edge. Logan, what are you talking about? She asked, but her shaky voice gave her away. I laid the trap carefully. I got my DNA results back, I said, staring right in her wide eyes. Clara's don't match mine. Care to explain? Abigail froze, tears welling up in her eyes as if they were some kind of shield. It's not what you think, she stammered. Oh, it was exactly what I thought. When she finally spilled, I almost wished she hadn't. Turns out, during one of the rough patches in our marriage, apparently defined by me working 60-hour weeks to keep the lights on, she had a moment of weakness with some guy from her boutique. She swore up and down it only happened once, but I didn't care. Once was enough. I couldn't even look at her. I grabbed my keys and bolted, driving aimlessly through Burlington until I found myself parked at a gas station, hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. What kind of idiot misses the warning signs? Her sudden interest in Pilates, the extra shifts at work, the phone always face down. God, I felt like such a sucker. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the convenience store sign flickering above me. How the hell was I supposed to go home after that? Every memory with Clara, now, felt like a lie. The bedtime stories, her little drawings with Daddy scrawled in messy crayon, even the way she'd run to me after scraping her knee, it all felt fake. Not because of her, but because of Abigail. She'd stolen the truth from me. When I finally dragged myself back, the house was dead silent. Abigail was still up, sitting at the dining table with her head in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and swollen. Logan, please, she started, but I held up a hand. Not now, I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Without saying another word, I went to the guest room and slammed the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was Abigail with that faceless man, laughing at me behind my back. The next morning, she tried again. Knocking softly on the guest room door, she said, Logan, we need to talk. Please. I ignored her. When I finally came out, she was waiting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand like some kind of peace offering. Logan, we have to figure this out. Clara doesn't know anything. She's innocent in all this. Innocent. The word hit me like a brick. Of course Clara was innocent. She didn't ask to be born into this mess. But knowing that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. I nodded without meeting Abigail's eyes, grabbed my keys, and left the house without a word. I needed space, air, anything but her apologies. I ended up at Lake Williston, a spot I used to go to as a kid when life felt overwhelming. The water was calm. The trees reflected in its surface like a mirror. Normally, this place brought me peace, but now it felt like even the lake was mocking me. My thoughts kept spiraling. Could I ever look at Clara the same way? Could I ever forgive Abigail? Did I even want to? When I got back that evening, Clara was in the living room, coloring. She looked up with that big, bright smile and said, "Daddy, look, I drew you a picture." It was the three of us under a rainbow, with my family scrawled at the top. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. How could something so simple tear me apart? "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I managed, forcing a smile. I kissed her head and went straight to the kitchen, where Abigail was cooking. She glanced at me, hopeful, but I cut her off. "Not in front of Clara," I said quietly. "We'll talk later." Dinner was torture. Clara chattered on about her day at school, while Abigail and I exchanged tense, silent glances. After we tucked Clara in, Abigail tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "No more lies," I said. "I need to know everything." "Who is he?" She hesitated, her lip trembling, before finally spilling the name. "His name is Kyle. We worked together. It happened during that rough patch when you were traveling so much. But it was only once, Logan. I swear." "Kyle." Just hearing his name made my blood boil. "Does he know about Clara?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "He moved to Boston right after it happened. He never knew, and I never told him. He's not part of our lives. He never was." Her words only made it worse. She had played God with my life, deciding what I did and did not deserve to know. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "You should have told me. I had the right to know." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared, Logan. I didn't want to lose you." "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "You managed to do that anyway." I grabbed my jacket and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I withdrew just enough money from our joint account to get by and bought a one-way bus ticket to Redmond, Oregon, a town I'd read about once in some random article. It sounded quiet, far enough away to disappear, but not so remote I couldn't find work. The bus ride was long and miserable, giving me way too much time to think. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara's face. I had abandoned her, the one person in all this mess who had done nothing wrong. But I couldn't stay, not with Abigail there, not with the constant reminder of her betrayal. When I finally arrived in Redmond, it felt like stepping into another world. The town was small, surrounded by forests and mountains, with a single main street lined with mom-and-pop shops. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts and paid for a week in advance. The room was bare bones, a bed, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom, but it was all I needed. The next morning, I started looking for work. With my experience as a contractor, I found a spot on a local construction crew almost immediately. The pay was decent and the physical labor was exactly what I needed to keep my mind off everything. I threw myself into the work, staying late every day until my body ached too much to think. Weeks went by in a blur. I kept my head down, avoided personal conversations, and spent my evenings alone in that dingy motel room. The people in Redmond were friendly enough, but I couldn't let anyone get close. My past felt like a shadow, always looming just behind me. One afternoon, after a grueling day of hauling lumber and pouring concrete, I decided to stop at a little diner called Rosie's Cafe. It had the kind of small-town charm you only see in postcards: checkered tablecloths, the faint smell of coffee and pie, and a bell that jingled every time someone walked in. I slid into a booth near the window, too tired to care about anything except getting some food in me. "Coffee?" a voice asked. I looked up to see a waitress, probably in her late 20s, with brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her name tag read Anna, and her smile was the first friendly thing I'd seen in weeks. "Yeah, thanks," I said, nodding. She poured a cup and set it down in front of me. "Haven't seen you around before," she said, handing me a menu. "Passing through?" Something like that. I muttered, not meeting her eyes. Anna didn't press. She just nodded and left me with the menu, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't suffocating under the weight of my own thoughts. I started stopping by Rosie's more often after that. The food was good, but it was Anna's warm, easygoing demeanor that kept me coming back. She didn't ask too many questions, and when she did, they were the kind that didn't dig too deep. Over time, her friendly chatter chipped away at the walls I'd built around myself. One evening, as I was nursing a cup of coffee after dinner, Anna came by with a slice of apple pie. "On the house," she said, setting it down in front of me with a grin. "You look like you could use a little sweetness in your life." I chuckled despite myself. "Thanks. I guess I could." As I took a bite, memories of home hit me like a freight train. Abigail used to bake apple pies in the fall, and Clara loved helping her in the kitchen, even if she made a mess of everything. The thought of Clara brought a lump to my throat. I must have looked upset because Anna tilted her head and asked, "You okay?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Anna didn't press, but her kindness lingered long after I left the diner. That night, as I lay on the lumpy motel bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Clara. I hadn't spoken to her since I left, and every day that passed felt like another nail in the coffin of our relationship. She didn't deserve this, any of it. Grabbing a notebook from the nightstand, I started writing her a letter. "Dear Clara," I wrote, "I know you're probably wondering where I've gone and why I'm not there to tuck you in at night. I wish I had an easy answer, but the truth is I needed time to think. None of this is your fault, and I hope you know how much I love you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I'm so sorry if I've made you feel otherwise." I didn't know if I'd ever send it, but writing the words felt like a small step toward making things right. The next morning, I sat at the construction site, staring blankly at the planks of wood stacked in front of me. My crew leader, a gruff man named Mike, gave me a side-eye. "You planning to build something with your mind, or are you going to pick up a hammer?" he barked. I mumbled an apology and got to work, but my head wasn't in it. Writing that letter to Clara had opened a floodgate of emotions I'd been trying to keep locked away. By the time lunch rolled around, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, not just from the work, but from the weight of everything swirling in my head. After my shift, I found myself back at Rosie's cafe. Anna greeted me with the same warm smile, but this time, she didn't just take my order and walk away. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said, leaning on the counter. I forced a smile. "It's nothing. Just tired." Anna gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, but didn't push. "Well, let me know if you need a refill," she said before walking off to another table. That night, I pulled out the letter to Clara again. I read it over and over, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. I still wasn't ready to send it, but I folded it neatly and tucked it into my bag just in case. A week later, everything changed. I came back to the motel after work and froze. There, in the parking lot, was a rental car with Vermont plates. My heart stopped as I saw Abigail standing next to it, her arms crossed and her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Logan," she said softly, stepping toward me. "I had to find you." My jaw tightened. "How did you even know I was here?" "I didn't," she admitted. "I've been searching for months. Clara misses you. She asks about you every day." The mention of Clara broke something in me. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. "What do you want, Abigail?" "I'm not here to pressure you," she said quickly. I need you to see Clara. She's in the car. She's been waiting to see you." I looked toward the car and saw her. Clara's small face was pressed against the window, her wide eyes lighting up when she spotted me. She gave a hesitant wave, and my legs felt like lead as I walked toward her. When I opened the door, she threw her arms around me, burying her face in my chest. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time in months, the wall of anger and resentment I'd built around myself started to crack. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice breaking. "I've missed you so much." Clara's hug was so tight, it felt like she was afraid I might disappear again. "You've gotten so big," I said, crouching down to her level. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, my voice cracking. "I missed a lot, huh?" She nodded solemnly, her big eyes locked on mine. "But you're here now," she said, her voice filled with a hope that hit me like a punch to the gut. Abigail stood a few feet away, her arms crossed as she watched us. Her face was a mixture of sadness and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe hope? Clara begged me to bring her, she said softly. I told her we'd only come if you were okay with it. Clara's tiny hands tugged at my sleeve. Can we have a sleepover, Daddy? Like we used to. I glanced at Abigail, unsure what to say. She nodded slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. It's up to you, she said. I can get a room at the motel down the road if you're okay with her staying. Clara's pleading eyes were impossible to resist. All right, I said, forcing a smile, but only if you promise to go to bed on time. Her face lit up with excitement. I promise, she said, already running toward the motel room to claim her spot on the bed. Abigail hesitated at the door. I'll come back in the morning, she said quietly. Let me know if you need anything. I nodded, unable to find the words. She lingered for a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with Clara for the first time in months. That evening, it was like stepping back into the life I'd left behind. We ate pizza on the bed, built a fort out of spare blankets, and watched her favorite cartoons. Clara talked nonstop about school, her friends, and her newfound obsession with dinosaurs. Mommy says I can be a paleontologist, she said proudly, mispronouncing the word in the most adorable way. I chuckled, feeling something warm stir in my chest for the first time in what felt like forever. You can be anything you want, sweetheart. For a few hours, it was just us. No awkward silences, no lingering resentment. Just me and my daughter, laughing like nothing had changed. When she finally fell asleep, her small hand clutching mine, I felt a pang of guilt, so deep it was almost unbearable. How could I have walked away from this? From her? The next morning, Abigail knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. Clara was still asleep, curled up under the blankets of the makeshift fort we'd built. Abigail's eyes scanned the room, landing on the peaceful expression on Clara's face. She missed you so much, she said quietly, sitting down at the small table by the window. I missed her too, I admitted, my voice low. But I couldn't stay, Abigail. You know that. She nodded, looking down at her hands. I know. I needed you to see her, to remind you of what we had. What we had, I repeated bitterly, shaking my head. You broke that, Abigail. You tore it apart. She looked up, tears welling in her eyes. I know I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I need you to know that it wasn't just about me, Logan. It was about protecting Clara. There's something I didn't tell you. Her words stopped me cold. What do you mean? She hesitated, then took a deep breath. Kyle, he wasn't stable. After that night, I realized he wasn't someone I wanted in my life, or Clara's. I leaned back in my chair, staring at Abigail like she just slapped me. What are you saying, Abigail? That he's dangerous? She quickly shook her head. Not dangerous, at least not in the way you think. But he had anger issues. He was volatile. After it happened, I realized it wasn't just a mistake. It was a huge risk. I didn't want him anywhere near Clara. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Abigail hadn't just betrayed me. She had made decisions about my life, about Clara's life, without me. You should have told me, I said, my voice tight. You should have trusted me with the truth. I know, she whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. I was scared, Logan. I was trying to protect you, to protect her, but I see now that I handled it all wrong. I stood up abruptly, needing space to process everything. I can't do this right now, I said, running a hand through my hair. I need time. Logan, she called after me, her voice breaking. Please don't shut me out. Not again. But I couldn't stay. I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there, her face crumpled with grief. Outside, the crisp morning air hit me like a splash of cold water. I walked aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of everything. When I finally returned to the motel, Clara was awake, sitting on the bed and drawing in her notebook. She looked up and beamed at me. Daddy, look, I drew us at the park. She held up a picture of the three of us under a bright yellow sun, her stick-figure family, surrounded by green trees. My chest tightened. Clara didn't care about the mess Abigail and I had made. To her, we were still a family. I crouched down next to her, smoothing a hand over her messy hair. It's beautiful, sweetheart, I said softly. Just like you. Abigail was sitting quietly by the window, watching us with a cautious expression. For once, she didn't try to speak. She just let me have that moment with Clara. Over the next few days, Abigail stayed in Redmond, renting a small cabin a few miles away. Clara was overjoyed to have both her parents in one place, even if things weren't the same as before. For her sake, we tried to create some sense of normalcy. We took her to the park, watched her favorite movies, and even went out for ice cream like we used to. But the cracks were still there, just beneath the surface. Every interaction with Abigail felt like walking on thin ice. She didn't push, but I could feel her hope hanging in the air every time she looked at me. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to find a way back to what we had. But the other part of me, the part that was still raw and angry, wasn't sure if I could. One afternoon, Clara begged me to take her to Baker's Hollow, a small park on the edge of town with winding trails and a wooden playground. Abigail came with us, and for a while, it almost felt like old times. We watched Clara climb the jungle gym, her laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Abigail sat next to me on a bench, her hands folded in her lap. "Do you think we'll ever fix this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared out at the playground, watching Clara race down the slide. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know one thing. I'm not walking away from her again. She deserves better than that." Abigail nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That's all I can ask for." That evening, after Clara had fallen asleep in her makeshift fort of pillows and blankets, I found myself sitting across from Abigail at the small motel table. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the heater the only sound between us. She looked at me, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe regret, maybe hope. "I don't want to push you, Logan," she said softly. "I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did. But I need you to know that I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'll be here." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to snap back or walk away. I just nodded, the weight of everything settling over me like a heavy blanket. The next few weeks were a strange dance between hope and hesitation. Abigail and Clara stayed in Redmond longer than I expected, renting a small cabin near the outskirts of town. Clara loved it. She spent her days exploring the woods behind the cabin and proudly showing off her treasures of leaves, rocks, and sticks. Abigail, to her credit, didn't push. She kept her distance, only reaching out when it involved Clara. But even in those moments, I could see the quiet longing in her eyes. She wasn't just here for Clara. She was here for us, even if she didn't say it outright. One afternoon, Clara dragged me to Baker's Hollow again. It had quickly become her favorite spot in Redmond. Abigail came along, and for a while it was almost peaceful. We watched Clara climb the jungle gym, her laughter ringing out as she raced across the wooden bridge. "Logan," Abigail said quietly, breaking the silence between us. "Do you ever think about what it would take to fix this?" I didn't answer right away. I watched Clara, her hair wild in the autumn wind, her face flushed with joy. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know I want to be here for her, no matter what." Abigail nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "That's all I can hope for." As the weeks went on, I found myself softening, little by little. Abigail wasn't the same woman who had made that mistake all those years ago. She was trying, in her own quiet way, to make amends, not just for me but for Clara. And while I wasn't sure if forgiveness was possible, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let my anger ruin Clara's chance at having a family. One night, as Clara slept soundly in her room at the cabin, Abigail and I sat outside on the small porch. The stars were bright against the inky sky, and the air was crisp and cool. Abigail broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about what we had?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's hard to think about that without thinking about everything else." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't expect you to forget, Logan, or even forgive me. I want to try. For Clara. For us." I let out a long breath, my eyes following the flickering light of a firefly in the distance. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had," I said finally. "But maybe we can figure out something new." Abigail's breath hitched, and when I looked at her, Her face was streaked with tears. "I'd like that," she whispered. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. The following weeks were a tentative balancing act. Abigail and I started spending more time together. Not as a couple, but as co-parents trying to create some semblance of normalcy for Clara. We still lived in separate places, but for the first time it felt like we were working towards something instead of pulling apart. Clara, of course, was thrilled. She didn't care that her mom and dad were walking on eggshells around each other. To her, having both of us, there was all that mattered. Every time she smiled at me or held my hand, I felt a little less of the anger that had been weighing me down for so long. One Saturday, Clara begged us to have a family day at the park. Abigail and I exchanged wary glances but agreed. For the first time in years, we packed a picnic and headed out as a trio. Clara raced ahead of us, her laughter echoing through the trees as she climbed the jungle gym and swung from the monkey bars. Abigail and I sat on the bench, our conversation cautious but civil. She talked about the small bookstore where she had started working, and I told her about my construction projects. It wasn't the deep, soul-bearing kind of talk we used to have, but it was something. As the day went on, the tension between us started to ease. We even laughed a little when Clara insisted on showing us her fossil collection of random rocks she had picked up around the park. By the time we packed up and headed home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But hope was a fragile thing, and I knew better than to trust it completely. That night, as Clara slept soundly in her bed, Abigail and I found ourselves sitting on the couch in her cabin, the silence between us heavy. "Logan," she began, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said, about figuring out something new." I looked at her, unsure where she was going with this. "Yeah, I know it's not going to be easy," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "But I want to try, not just for Clara, but for us. I miss what we had, and I miss you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reach out, to tell her I missed her too. But another part of me, the part still nursing old wounds, held back. "I don't know, Abigail," I said finally. "I don't know if I can ever fully get past what happened, but I'm willing to try. For Clara's sake, if nothing else." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded, her expression one of quiet acceptance. "That's all I can ask for." The next morning, as I was leaving the cabin, Clara ran up to me, clutching a drawing in her hands. "Daddy, look, it's us," she said, holding up a crayon drawing of the three of us standing under a rainbow. At the top, she had written my family in big, shaky letters. I knelt down, taking the drawing from her. My throat tightened as I looked at it. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "Just like you." Clara grinned, her little arms wrapping tightly around my neck. "Does this mean we're a family again?" she asked, her voice hopeful. I glanced over at Abigail, who was standing in the doorway, watching us with tears in her eyes. I didn't have an answer for Clara, not yet. But as I hugged her, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking away again. Over the next few weeks, life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was something. Abigail and I started finding ways to co-parent without stepping on each other's toes. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara had both her parents in her life. Her joy was contagious, and every time she laughed, it chipped away at the wall I had built around my heart. One evening, Abigail invited me over for dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt significant. We sat at the small dining table in her cabin, the three of us sharing stories and laughing like we used to. For a moment, it felt almost normal. Almost. After Clara went to bed, Abigail and I sat on the porch, the night air cool against our skin. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing against mine for just a second too long. I didn't pull away, and she didn't apologize. "Logan," she said after a long silence, "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I know I broke something in us that might never fully heal, but I'm still here. I still care about you." I stared out at the dark forest, the distant sound of crickets filling the silence. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice quiet. "But it's going to take time, Abigail. A lot of time." She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'll wait," she said softly. "However long it takes, I'll wait." It wasn't the sweeping declaration of love or forgiveness she might have hoped for, but it was the truth. And for now, that was enough. The real turning point came one rainy afternoon when Clara and I were playing in the living room of her cabin. She was building a tower out of blocks, her face scrunched up in concentration, when she suddenly looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling down next to her. She shrugged, her small hands fidgeting with a block. "You smile more now, but sometimes you still look sad. I just want you to be happy." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as my chest ached with a mix of love and guilt. "I am happy, Clara," I said, my voice thick. "I'm happy because I have you." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what Clara had said. She was right. I was smiling more, but I was also still holding on to the anger and hurt that had driven me away in the first place. Maybe it was time to let some of that go. The next morning, I sat down with Abigail at the kitchen table. Clara was outside, playing in the yard, her laughter drifting in through the open window. Abigail looked at me, her face cautious but hopeful. "I've been thinking," I said, my hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "About us. About what comes next." She didn't say anything, just waited, her eyes locked on mine. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were," I continued. "But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can build something new, something better." Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she reached across the table, her hand brushing against mine. "I'd like that," she whispered. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't a perfect ending, and it wasn't a promise of forever. But it was a beginning, and for now that was enough. Over the next month, Abigail and I began the slow process of rebuilding something between us. It was not a reconciliation, at least not in the traditional sense, but a careful attempt at understanding each other again. The wounds from her betrayal had not healed completely, but I could feel the anger that once consumed me slowly fading. We took small steps. Sunday mornings were spent having pancakes together at Rosie's Cafe, where Clara delighted the staff by sharing her latest dinosaur discoveries. We worked as a team to help her with school projects and celebrated her milestones together. It was awkward at first, but over time, those moments started to feel less forced. One evening, after putting Clara to bed, Abigail asked me to stay for tea. It was a quiet night, the kind where words were not necessary to fill the space. She handed me a mug, and as I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, I noticed her watching me. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked softly. I knew what she meant. Sometimes, I admitted, but I also know we can't live in the past. It's not about what might have been. It's about what we can make of now. Her lips trembled as she nodded. "I want to be someone you can trust again, Logan. Not just for Clara, but for you." Her words hung in the air, and I let them linger, unsure how to respond. Trust was not something that could be rebuilt with promises. It would take time, effort, and consistency. But her sincerity moved me. Maybe, just maybe, she meant it. The next weekend, Clara came running into the house, holding up a piece of paper with stars and glitter plastered all over it. "Daddy, look," she exclaimed, shoving it into my hands. "It's a family picture. Mommy helped me draw it." I looked at the drawing, my throat tightening. The three of us stood side by side under a bright yellow sun, and Clara had written "Forever Family" in bold, uneven letters. Abigail stood in the doorway, watching us, her expression unreadable. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "You're getting better at this every day." "Mommy says we can put it on the fridge," Clara added excitedly, grabbing a magnet and rushing to display her masterpiece. Abigail stepped closer, her voice soft. "She's so happy now, Logan. I haven't seen her smile this much in years." I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from Clara's drawing. "She deserves this. She deserves a family." Abigail hesitated, then placed a hand lightly on my arm. "And so do you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. Not the mistakes, not the betrayal, but the person underneath. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. That night, as I lay in bed, Clara's words echoed in my mind. "Forever family." It was a simple phrase, one that carried more weight than I was ready to admit. But for her, I was willing to try. For her, I was willing to hope.